The invitation had been sent to an address in small-town Montana. A quiet woman, living quietly, working at a local hardware store. What the Pentagon didn't know was that they were summoning someone who officially didn't exist anymore. Someone who'd been declared killed in action. Someone who'd chosen to stay dead rather than explain what really happened that night in Kandahar. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story of sacrifice, identity, and the courage to step back into the light resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of heroes who chose silence over recognition until honor demanded otherwise. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Whitefish, Montana, as Victoria Kane unlocked the front door of Henderson's Hardware. At 38, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to minimize her presence in the world. Her auburn hair, now shoulder-length and touched with premature grey, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots that had seen better days. Henderson's Hardware was exactly what it appeared to be, a family-owned business serving the practical needs of a small mountain town. Victoria knew every bolt size, every paint colour, every tool specification in the cramped aisles. It was honest work, predictable work, the kind of life she had never imagined she would crave. She had been Victoria Kane for only 3 years. Before that, she had been someone else entirely. Someone whose name was carved into black granite in Arlington National Cemetery. Someone who had died in Afghanistan in the eyes of the world, allowing the real Victoria to disappear into the anonymity she desperately needed. The truth was more complicated than death, but infinitely more dangerous to explain. Mail arrived at 9:15, as it had every day for 3 years. Victoria sorted through the usual stack of invoices and advertising circulars with practiced indifference. Then her hand stopped. Among the mundane correspondence lay an envelope bearing the unmistakable eagle and stars of the Department of Defense. Her name, her current name, was typed precisely across the front in official military correspondence font. Victoria stared at the envelope for several minutes before setting it aside. Whatever the military wanted, it could wait. She had learned the art of patience during her years in hiding. The discipline of controlling her immediate reactions to unexpected situations. Tom Henderson arrived at 10 o'clock, his weathered face brightening at the sight of his most reliable employee. At 72, Tom had owned the hardware store for 45 years and had seen enough of small-town life to recognize when someone was running from something. He'd never asked Victoria about her past, and she'd never offered to explain it. "Morning, Vic," Tom called out, using the shortened version of her name that everyone in Whitefish knew her by. "Busy day ahead. We've got that delivery coming in from Missoula, and the Morrison Ranch needs those fence posts by noon." Victoria nodded, grateful for the familiar routine. Work meant focus, and focus meant not thinking about the envelope that seemed to radiate significance from behind the cash register. The morning passed in a blur of customers and inventory. Victoria helped old Mrs. Patterson find the right size screws for her screen door repair, advised Jake Morrison on fence post spacing, and sorted through a delivery of electrical supplies. Her movements were practiced and efficient, but her mind kept drifting to the unopened letter. During her lunch break, Victoria finally allowed herself to examine the envelope more closely. The return address confirmed her worst fears. Medal of Honor, Review Board, Department of Defense. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing official letterhead and formal military language that transported her back to a world she had worked desperately to forget. The letter was brief and devastating in its implications. Staff Sergeant Victoria Kane is hereby invited to attend a Medal of Honor presentation ceremony at the Pentagon on November 15, 2024. Your presence is requested to receive the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Afghanistan. Transportation and accommodation will be provided. Victoria read the letter 3 times before its full meaning penetrated her carefully constructed defenses. The military had somehow connected her current identity to her former life. Worse, they wanted to honor her for actions that had forced her to fake her own death and disappear from the world. The events in Kandahar 8 years ago had been classified at levels that made normal debriefing impossible. Victoria's unit had stumbled into an operation so sensitive, so deeply embedded in international intelligence networks, that acknowledging their success would have compromised ongoing missions and endangered assets in multiple countries. The official story became that Staff Sergeant Samantha Hayes and her team had been killed in an enemy ambush. Funeral services were held, families were notified, and careers were officially ended. In reality, Victoria and 2 other survivors had been extracted, debriefed by people whose names she never learned, and given new identities in exchange for their silence. The arrangement had seemed fair at the time. Victoria was tired of war, tired of carrying the weight of classified operations, tired of living with the knowledge that some victories could never be celebrated. A quiet life in Montana had seemed like a gift, not a punishment. Now the Pentagon wanted to drag her back into the light. Victoria spent the afternoon in a haze, mechanically helping customers while her mind raced through possibilities. She could ignore the invitation. The military couldn't force her to attend a ceremony honoring someone who was supposed to be dead. But the implications of their knowledge troubled her deeply. If they had found her, who else might know where she was? Tom noticed her distraction during the afternoon inventory. "You seem a million miles away today, Vic. Everything all right?" Victoria forced a smile. "Just thinking about some old business that needs settling." Tom studied her with the perceptive eyes of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize significant moments. Sometimes old business has a way of finding us whether we want it to or not. The important thing is how we choose to handle it. His words stayed with Victoria as she closed the store that evening. She drove home to her small cabin on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling that had become her refuge from the complexities of her former life. The cabin overlooked a small lake that reflected the surrounding pine forests, a view that had brought her peace during the difficult transition to civilian life. Inside the cabin, Victoria pulled out a locked box from beneath her bed. She hadn't opened it in 2 years, but the contents remained exactly as she had left them. Military documents, photographs from her deployment, and a single Purple Heart medal that had been presented to her family after her supposed death. Among the documents was a secure phone number that connected to a man known only as Colonel Morrison. He had been her contact during the transition to civilian life, someone who could be reached in case of emergencies. Victoria had hoped never to use the number. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you would call." "You knew about the invitation," Victoria said without preamble. "I authorized it," Colonel Morrison replied. "The political landscape has changed, Vic. What happened in Kandahar has been declassified to the extent necessary for recognition. The President wants to honor the real heroes of that operation. I chose to stay dead for good reasons. Those reasons no longer apply. The intelligence networks you protected have been compromised through other channels. Your sacrifice doesn't need to be permanent anymore." Victoria walked to her window, looking out at the lake that had become her world. "I've built a life here. People know me, trust me. I can't just disappear again." "You don't have to disappear. You can be both people, the hardware store employee in Montana and the decorated soldier who saved 17 lives in Afghanistan. The choice is yours." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Victoria's decision had been made the moment she heard that other people's lives had been saved by her actions. The details of that night in Kandahar came flooding back. The ambush that had gone wrong, the intelligence that had to be protected, the 17 soldiers whose extraction had depended on her team's sacrifice. She had never sought recognition for those actions, but she had also never forgotten the weight of responsibility that came with being a soldier. If the Pentagon wanted to honor her service, she owed it to her fallen comrades and to the soldiers she had saved to accept that honor with dignity. 3 weeks later, Victoria Kane stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing a dress blue uniform that felt both foreign and familiar after years in civilian clothes. The ceremony was smaller than she had expected, attended by family members of other recipients, military officials, and a carefully selected group of personnel who had appropriate security clearances. General Patterson, a distinguished officer whose chest bore the testimony of 30 years of service, stood at the podium reviewing his notes. He had conducted dozens of these ceremonies, but something about today felt different. The recipient's file had been heavily redacted, and the backstory provided by the Pentagon contained gaps that suggested classified operations. As General Patterson called Victoria's name, she stepped forward with the bearing of someone who had earned every step. The assembled audience rose to their feet, but Victoria's attention was focused on the general's face. She watched as recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by confusion, and then a kind of awe. General Patterson had attended Staff Sergeant Samantha Hayes' funeral 8 years earlier. He had delivered the eulogy for a soldier who had supposedly died serving her country. Yet here stood that same soldier, alive and ready to receive the Medal of Honor under a different name. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Patterson began, his voice carrying a weight that went beyond the standard ceremony script. "It is my extraordinary honor to present the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Victoria Kane for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty." The general paused, collecting himself as the full implications of what he was witnessing settled in. He had been briefed that this was an unusual ceremony, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of honoring someone he had believed dead for 8 years. As the citation was read, detailing actions that had been classified for 8 years, Victoria felt the weight of her hidden identity finally beginning to lift. The audience learned of her leadership during a complex extraction operation under enemy fire, her willingness to remain behind to ensure the safety of 17 soldiers, and her instrumental role in protecting intelligence assets that had saved countless additional lives in subsequent operations. The citation described how Staff Sergeant Kane had coordinated a rescue operation while under heavy enemy fire, using her advanced tactical knowledge to guide extraction helicopters through a complex urban environment. She had identified and neutralized multiple enemy positions, established secure communication with command, and maintained operational control even after sustaining serious injuries. Most remarkably, when the extraction helicopters arrived, Victoria had refused evacuation until every member of her unit and the trapped soldiers they had been sent to rescue were safely aboard. She had remained on the ground, providing suppressive fire and tactical coordination until the final helicopter departed. Her actions had saved 17 lives and preserved critical intelligence that had prevented multiple terrorist attacks in the following months. When General Patterson placed the medal around Victoria's neck, he leaned close enough to whisper, "Welcome back from the dead, soldier." Victoria's response was equally quiet, but carried the strength of someone who had finally found peace with both her hidden and revealed identities. "Thank you for letting me serve again, sir." The ceremony concluded with the traditional reception, but Victoria found herself surrounded not by strangers, but by the family members of soldiers she had saved 8 years earlier. They had been invited without knowing exactly why, but their presence completed a circle that had been broken by necessity and secrecy. Master Sergeant Carlos Rivera approached her during the reception, his eyes bright with recognition and emotion. He had been one of the 17 soldiers extracted from Kandahar, and his survival had allowed him to see his daughter graduate from high school and his son enter the Naval Academy. "I never forgot your voice on the radio that night," he told Victoria, his voice thick with emotion. "You stayed behind so we could get out. I've wanted to thank you for 8 years, but I thought you were dead." Victoria's composure finally cracked slightly. "You were all worth staying behind for." Rivera's wife Maria joined them with tears streaming down her face. "Because of you, my children still have their father. Carlos told me about that night, how someone coordinated the extraction, stayed behind to make sure everyone got out safely. We've been praying for that guardian angel for 8 years, never knowing if we'd ever get to say thank you." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening, each one adding weight to Victoria's understanding of the ripple effects her actions had created. Parents who still had sons because of her sacrifice. Children who had grown up with fathers who might have been lost. Wives who had avoided becoming widows. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, now Captain Martinez, had been the youngest soldier extracted that night at just 22 years old. She approached Victoria with her 3-year-old daughter in her arms and her husband, also a soldier, by her side. "This is Elena," Captain Martinez said, her voice breaking slightly. She exists because you made sure I came home. I named her after you. Well, after the name we knew you by then, Elena Samantha Martinez. Victoria knelt down to the little girl's level, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Hello, Elena. You have a very brave mother. The child studied Victoria with the serious expression that only small children can manage. Mommy says you're a hero. Your mommy is the hero, Victoria replied softly. I just helped her get home safely so she could become your mother. Captain Martinez's husband, Major David Martinez, extended his hand to Victoria. My wife has told me about that night countless times. What you did, staying behind, coordinating everything, making sure everyone got out. That's the kind of leadership they write about in military textbooks. But more than that, it's the kind of sacrifice that lets families like ours exist. As the evening progressed, Victoria learned about the lives that had been built on the foundation of her sacrifice. Rivera had become a senior non-commissioned officer and was now training the next generation of soldiers. Martinez had risen through the ranks and was commanding her own unit. Sergeant First Class Williams had survived to walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding just 6 months earlier. Each story reinforced Victoria's understanding that her decision to accept the Pentagon's invitation had been about more than personal recognition. It was about acknowledging the interconnected nature of service and sacrifice, the way one person's actions in a moment of crisis could echo through generations. Colonel Morrison found Victoria near the end of the reception, noting the transformation in her demeanor. So what happens now? He asked. Now I get to choose, Victoria replied, looking around the room filled with people whose lives had been touched by her sacrifice. You can return to Montana and your hardware store, or you can consider other opportunities in the military or government service. Your country has need of people with your skills and experience. Victoria considered the options as she watched children play in the corner of the reception hall. Children whose fathers were alive because of decisions made on a dark night in Afghanistan 8 years ago. I think I'd like to go home to Montana, Victoria said finally. But maybe I can serve my country in other ways. There are veterans in my community who could use someone who understands what they've been through. Morrison nodded approvingly. Sometimes the most important service happens far from the battlefield. The next morning, Victoria called Tom Henderson from her hotel room in Washington. Tom, it's Vic. I have something important to tell you about why I was distracted yesterday. You don't owe me any explanations, Vic. You've been the best employee I've ever had. I think I do owe you an explanation. And when I get back, I'd like to talk about expanding the store's services, maybe creating a space for local veterans to gather, get support, share experiences. Tom was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. That sounds like exactly what this community needs. We'll make it happen. 6 months later, Victoria Kane, no longer hiding behind a false identity, had transformed Henderson's hardware into something unprecedented in the small mountain community. The store still served its traditional function, but the back room had been converted into a meeting space where veterans could gather weekly to discuss their experiences, challenges, and victories. Victoria facilitated these sessions with the same quiet competence she had shown in Afghanistan, creating a safe space for people to process their military experiences without judgment or pressure. The group had grown from 3 attendees to more than 20, drawing veterans from across Montana who drove hours to participate in meetings led by someone who truly understood their struggles. One evening, during a particularly emotional session, retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres shared his ongoing battle with survivor's guilt after losing members of his unit in Iraq. I keep wondering why I made it home when better men didn't, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria listened carefully before responding, her own experiences informing her words. I've learned that survival isn't about being better or worse than those we lost. Sometimes it's about being in the right place to serve in a different way. Your survival gives you the opportunity to honor their memory by helping others navigate the same struggles you've faced. Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and Torres nodded slowly. You really understand this, don't you? Not just intellectually, but in your bones. I understand carrying the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances, Victoria replied. And I understand that sometimes the hardest part of service comes after the uniform comes off. The transformation of Henderson's hardware into a veteran support centre had attracted attention from across the state. Victoria had been invited to speak at conferences and training sessions, but she preferred to focus on the direct service she could provide in her own community. Tom Henderson, who had learned the truth about his employees' past through the media coverage, couldn't have been prouder. Turns out I hired a genuine American hero, he told customers with obvious satisfaction, though I always knew there was something special about Vic. Victoria's Medal of Honor had been displayed in the store's front window, serving as a reminder that heroes often hide in plain sight. The display also included photographs from the Pentagon ceremony and letters from some of the soldiers whose lives she had saved. The 17 soldiers whose lives she had saved in Afghanistan had all been invited to visit Whitefish, and several had made the journey with their families. These visits had become informal reunions, where the soldiers could show their children the woman who had ensured their fathers came home safely. Rivera had brought his entire family for a week-long visit. His daughter, now a senior in high school, had written her college application essay about meeting the woman who had saved her father's life. Captain Martinez had visited with her daughter Elena, now 4 years old, and fascinated by the idea that her namesake was a real hero. During their visit, Martinez had pulled Victoria aside for a private conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said at the Pentagon, about serving in different ways. I'm considering leaving active duty and working with veteran organisations when my current assignment ends." Victoria had nodded approvingly. The transition from military to civilian life is one of the most challenging things we face, and having people who understand that challenge makes all the difference. The transformation from hidden identity to recognised hero had not been easy, but Victoria had learned that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. Her decision to step back into the light had not only honoured her own service, but had also allowed her to serve her community in new and meaningful ways. Late in the evening, when the store was closed and the town had settled into its peaceful rhythm, Victoria would sometimes stand by the lake behind her cabin and think about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been a soldier, a ghost, a hardware store employee, and finally a decorated hero. Each identity had been real and necessary in its own time. But perhaps the most important identity was the one she was building now, a bridge between the military world she had served and the civilian community she had joined, helping others navigate the complex transition between two lives that didn't always fit together easily. Victoria Kane had learned that heroism wasn't a single act performed in a moment of crisis. It was a way of living that honoured the sacrifices of those who hadn't made it home and served those who had. Her Medal of Honor represented not just one night in Afghanistan, but a lifetime commitment to the values that had guided her through the war and peace, recognition and anonymity, death and rebirth. Have you ever known someone who carried extraordinary experiences behind an ordinary exterior? Someone whose quiet presence suggested depths that were never fully revealed? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. If this story of hidden service and eventual recognition resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales of heroes who serve in silence until honor calls them back into the light.